Okay, today we're going to talk about the connection between psychology and physical health. Mental health and physical health are intimately connected to each other. You could go all the way back to Hippocrates. Hippocrates would be the father of medicine, and in the original Hippocratic view of medicine, of course, they had kind of a misconception about psychological functioning, but what they believed was that the body was composed of four humors. The black bile and the yellow bile and the blood and I don't even know what the four humors were. But according to Hippocrates, the idea was the physician's job is to find the imbalance in the four humors. Find the imbalance in the four humors and find a way to get those four humors back into balance. Okay, and so we find that even from the beginning, Hippocrates was implementing a biopsychosocial model. Physical illness is caused by biological problems, psychological problems, and sociocultural factors. Sociocultural factors, as we said, like poverty or something, which then comes back and creates psychological factors, stress, which then come back and create biological factors. Okay, so health psychology is a branch of psychology that I like to think of it this way. Traditional medicine is like this. Imagine you're an automobile, and traditional medical model is wait until the automobile is broken and then take it to the mechanic to get it fixed. Whereas health psychology imagines it this way. Instead of waiting until your automobile is broken, how about you do proper maintenance or preventative things to make sure that the car never gets broken in the first place and doesn't have to go to the mechanic? And that's kind of what health psychology uses as its mantra. Let's make sure that the machine doesn't get broken rather than focusing on fixing it after it's broken. Well, we find that physical problems that are related to psychological factors, of course, headaches and backaches, and we're going to talk about the muscle tension. We have talked about the muscle tension associated with the fight or flight response, and etc. However, one of the biggest components that we talked about repeatedly was how when your body's in the fight or flight mode, remember the sympathetic nervous system is kicked into high gear. And the sympathetic nervous system is an incredibly expensive system. It takes a lot of energy to run the sympathetic nervous system. And so what happens is non-vital functions get shortchanged, right? Get turned off. And one of the most non-vital functions involved is the immune system. And so we find anything that involves the immune system can be impacted when under stress or other psychological problems. So we find skin disorders. Many skin disorders are really just a malfunctioning of the immune system. Either it gets too strong or it shuts down. But asthma and ulcers are also often, well, asthma in particular is often an immune system malfunction. Stress personality, yes. We mentioned this at one other point. There's a huge connection between hostility and heart risk. And so, as we had said, people are often categorized as type A and type B. Type A people, as we said, are competitive, hard driving, aggressive, impatient, now, it's got to be my way, etc. The type B are much more easygoing, just let it go. If it's not important, you don't have to fight about everything kind of person. Well, in this graph, what we have is a very cool finding. What happened was in the orange line there, okay, this is control patients. So the patients at the far left end had heart attacks. After their heart attack, they were given traditional advice, these control groups. Traditional advice involved things like, hey, you need to exercise, you need to watch your diet, okay, something like this. And so what happens is that along the axis there is percentage of patients that have a second heart attack. And so as you can see, as you moved from 1978 up to 1982, patients in the control group had an increased risk of heart attack as time went on, right? Heart attacks went up. Well, in this lifestyle modification, the green line, same thing. They had heart attacks in 1978, and then they were given the same advice, hey, you got to watch you got to exercise, you got to watch your diet. But then they were also taught about that type A lifestyle thing. They were taught, okay, when you're hard driven and aggressive, that can lead to some real physical problems. So maybe you need to learn to just let it go. All right, figure out which things are important in life, and then it's not important. I think it's part of the stress appraisal process, but that's neither here nor there, right? And so you take a look, those that were taught about that type A lifestyle and how it leads to bad physical problems didn't have that rise in the increase in heart attack rates. So there's clearly a connection between these things. The hostility that arises out of the type A personality. Hostility, I'm just moving slides. Okay, hostility, the participant, negative attitude, cynical, mistrusting, etc. Not his hostility is linked to coronary disease again because the wear and tear and the self-imposed stress, and because when you're under hostility, it's essentially going to be much the same reaction as under stress. You're going to get the fight or flight mode in action. You tend to, when under hostility, ignore good habits, but also less social support. Who wants to hang out with somebody that's hostile all the time? Yeah, depression can cause heart disease. Depression is, in many ways, a chronic stressor. It's like a stressful situation that you are under day after day after day. And so, to the event that any chronic stressor can have problems, then clearly depression can be connected to these problems. Stress is highly related to cancer. In fact, they did a fascinating study with rats one time. And what they did was they took rats and they implanted a cancer tumor in all of the rats. And then half of the rats, they gave them stress. And you know how you stress a rat out? And this is horrible. I didn't know it. Don't blame me. But they take the rats and they put a big bucket of water and they put the rats on an itty bitty tiny little platform. So the rats have to like balance themselves, and if they don't balance properly, they fall into the water. Okay. So this creates a lot of stress in the rats as measured by stress hormones. So you can measure the actual cortisol levels to see that. And what happens is those rats that were put under stress are far, far, far more likely to develop cancer. Those rats that were not under stress were far, far, far more likely to have their immune system kick out the cancer. But it's also related to the common cold. Remember the example I had said about the dental students and the puncture wound on their hand in the middle of the semester? It healed rather quickly. During finals week, it didn't heal very well. Well, it's the same thing with a common cold. People tend to get colds that, the week after finals are over. That's just the way it works, okay? So why do people engage in unhealthy habits and behaviors? Well, number one, these habits often evolve slowly. They just sort of creep up on you. You don't realize that they're there until they are. What happens is those things that are unhealthy are often, again, I'm not teaching the self-regulation or self-control in this particular topic, but yeah, it turns out that those unhealthy habits like going out with your friends instead of staying home and doing your homework are just pleasant, all right? They're just more fun. That's the problem, all right? Those things that are worst for you are the ones that tend to feel the best at the moment. Why do you eat the great big slice of chocolate cake, even though in the back of your mind you know it's a bad choice because it feels good right now, okay? And risks may take some time to develop. It's maybe not the first slice of chocolate cake that makes a difference or the second or the third. It's something like that. But also people have an unrealistic optimism. This is also called Superman syndrome. Yeah, I recognize that smoking leads to death, but not for me. All right, that just applies to everybody else. Okay, and so all of a sudden, we're combine that with conflicting information about what's healthy and what isn't. And just this morning, I got right there on the news. For many, 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 many years, I've always been told white meat is healthier than red meat, right? So if you eat your pork and your chicken, you're doing good for your heart. But if you eat the beef, you're not. And so it's like, okay, cool. But then just this morning, like, no, white meat is just as unhealthy as red meat. And so all of a sudden, why might we have bad habits? Because we're getting conflicting information. Nobody tells us the truth. Which kind of habits that we have? Smoking, obviously. Smoking has declined in recent years a lot, and I'm impressed with this, but there's still a huge amount, especially outside of the United States. Rates of smoking in certain parts of the world are still incredibly high, but much less in the United States. That's good, but definitely not gone. And unfortunately, people are starting to switch over and they think vaping is somehow the healthy alternative. Yeah, I don't know about that. So clearly, these habits can be connected to stress or bad health, overeating, lack of exercise, etc. Okay, so clearly. So check this out. Why do you think that America has this huge obesity problem? And I mean, there's a lot of a lot of background to it, but why might the United States? Other nations don't have this problem. I mean, my wife and I, we just went to Europe a couple weeks ago, and um, sorry, Europeans don't look like that. It doesn't. I mean, sometimes but pretty much when you're going around Europe, you can see who's a tourist and who's not. Okay, it's pretty obvious. Why? Well, take a look. Here is just a simple example. On the left is a French bucket of yogurt. On the right is an American bucket of yogurt. So flat out, a serving size is just radically different. Okay? Look at this. McDonald's French fries are 70% bigger in the United States. You just go in and get a standard French fries. That's what you get. A meal at a Chinese restaurant in America is just 60% larger than what you would get in France. Okay? I don't understand it myself because I can rarely get even halfway through any plate, even if I order the child size. In the U.S., recipes just call for more ingredients, more portions, period. Even in the United States, fruit is bigger. We expect our fruit to be larger. I mean, I, I got it, okay? But cat food in France is larger. I don't know. Maybe something going on there. But it's more than just that. See, in the United States, we've had a cultural shift. Not only are American French fries much larger than French fries. Now that's ironic. But check it out. A standard French fry in the 1950s was 2.4 ounces. 2003, it was 7.1. Okay, that's like 3 times the size or close to it anyway. A soda was 7 ounces in the 50s. 7 ounces? That's like one. Boom. Where did it go? Right? Nowadays, what is it? 64? 32 minimum. 32 minimum, right? But yeah, 64, 128 could be. Okay. A hamburger, 3.9 ounces. Now it's up to 12.6. In fact, if you go over to McDonald's nowadays, I doubt you're going to be able to find a hamburger on the menu. It just won't even be there, okay? I think the smallest you're ever going to find is a cheeseburger meal, and that's for 2 cheeseburgers. You can't just walk in and say, I would like to have it. Well, no, you can't. You can ask for a hamburger, don't get me wrong, but you won't find it on the menu. It won't be up there, okay? Chances are if you ask for a hamburger, they're going to be like, I have to ask my manager about this, okay? Muffins are much larger. Servings of pasta have become larger. But it's more than that. Because in France, they take more time eating food. So even though their meal at McDonald's is a lot smaller, it takes them 50% longer to finish it. Okay? They savor it. It's really in France they don't pretend that things are healthy, they don't be like fat free, gluten free. You just don't find that in France, okay? They just like it is what it is. Here's some whole milk. Just you want it, drink it. If you don't, okay? And so there's just different attitudes, different ways of thinking. Look at this. People were asked to choose an option for a metaphor for the human body. Is a human body in relation to its diet like a tree, like a car, or like a temple? In France, they said it was like a tree, it allows us to bloom and sprout. For Americans, they said it was a car. It's like gasoline that you put in the engine. In other words, you must have it, right? You must have gasoline in order to make the car function. In fact, here is attitudes towards food. Along the top is males and the bottom is females, and then we looked at France, Belgium, Japan, and the United States. And we call these things turn-off faces. and they're a visual representation of attitudes based on sizes and everything else. And you can just see that in France, both males and females, their attitudes towards food are very positive, right? They have this positive association with food. Look at in the United States, especially the females. It's just like, look at the anger when they see food. This is their belief towards what food is. It's an absolute anger face. I'm just, that's really weird. Got to imagine that it impacts the way that food intersects with our bodies. All right, so we're going to talk drug use a little bit too here, because clearly, again, physical habits, physical things can lead to clearly, or psychological things can lead to physical problems. So we're going to talk about tolerance and physical tolerance and withdrawal. And wait, which ones do I have here? Tolerance, withdrawal. Yeah, I don't have those there. Okay, I got to be careful. All right. So tolerance, number one. Tolerance is a diminished response to the same amount of a drug. So at the beginning, 5 when a person starts taking a drug, 5 milligrams can lead to a high. But after they become an experienced, it takes 10 milligrams before they receive a high, something like that. And that's what tolerance is. And it's a fascinating, well beyond the scope of this course, but it's a fascinating idea because what's happening is that there's these two parallel processes that are going on. At one level, you have the amount of drug in your system, but at the same time, you have the body's reaction to the drug. And so what happens is that at the beginning, when you first started taking a drug, the body has no underlying reaction to it, and you experience the full impact of the drug. But after tolerance develops, what happens is that if you take 5 milligrams of the drug, the body will have an underlying process that knocks out that 5 milligrams. And so you need 5 more on top of the original 5 because your body has this secondary process that lies under it. But that's way beyond this course. What happens though is with this, what happens is once addiction has been created, then what happens is removal of the drug creates withdrawal syndrome, and that is of course this problem that once you remove the milligrams on the top of actual drug, then the underlying processes that knock it out are still occurring. Okay, and so all of a sudden, what happens is that remember, at the beginning, you take 5 milligrams, you feel 5 milligrams. Once tolerance has developed, you take 5 milligrams. There's 5 underneath that knock it out. You feel nothing. You take 10, you feel 5. Then once you take away the drug completely, you add 0 to the top, but there's still a -5 underneath, and so you feel -5. And that is what withdrawal is all about, is these physical symptoms that you feel once it's removed because you're no longer adding the drug, but the underlying processes are still running. Well, we find that this drug abuse or can be psychological or physical. Now, physical is what I just described, the idea that there is this underlying process that is knocking out the drug and in fact is still there even when there's no milligram of the actual drug. But what we find is that there can be psychological dependence, and that is the laws of association. That you come to associate, think principles of learning here, you come to associate the bathroom with heroin, you come to associate the car with heroin. And so what happens is when you get into different situations, it triggers cravings because there are simple associations, just like the association between salt and pepper. When I see a salt shaker, it makes me think of pepper. Once psychological dependence emerges, thoughts of bathroom leads to thoughts of heroin. Thoughts of car leads to thoughts of heroin. Okay? And so it's the same kind of simple associations as you would have between salt and pepper, just in a different situation. Let's see. There's different kinds of drugs, and let's see. Narcotics is just a real generic word for illegals. I'll leave that alone. Sedatives are drugs which essentially slow down the central nervous system. Stimulants speed up the central nervous system. Often sedatives, it's actually depressants is a better word instead of sedatives. So ultimately, all narcotics have their effect, and we haven't talked about the underlying neural processes yet, but very, very, very briefly. You can see in this picture here what we've got is these are neurons, okay? There is one neuron let's just pick, there's three different images here, so any one of them. At the top is what they call a sending neuron. At the bottom is a receiving neuron. Neurons transmit information. Okay, so the neuron at the top, the sending neuron, transmits information to the receiving neuron at the bottom. And the way it transmits information is something called neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are used to send a signal, to send information from the sending to the receiving neuron. Well, what narcotics do is they interfere in this signaling. In this little gap between, there's this tiny little gap between the sending and the receiving neuron called the synapse. It is in this synapse that these neurotransmitters are sent. Well, it turns out narcotics impact those neurotransmitters. Depends on what the drug is and depends on what the neurotransmitter is, but it turns out that, different narcotics can make it appear that there's more neurotransmitters. Different narcotics can block neurotransmitters. They can block the ability of a neurotransmitter to send its signal. They can block the reconsumption of, just all kinds of different ways. Narcotics, all narcotics impact that synapse in some way or another and affect the neurotransmitters. Other types or categories of drugs would be hallucinogens. Cannabis is simply marijuana, by the way. Cannabis is simply a version of a hallucinogen, just one of many. Hallucinogens might include like peyote, mushrooms, mescaline, something like that, PCP. But marijuana is just one of them. So clearly there's lots of kinds. There you go. Depressants, stimulants. In fact, depressants, stimulants, and hallucinogens is the three main categories. So well, I got to be careful about that. But yeah, all narcotics fall into one of these three: stimulants, depressants, or hallucinogens. Okay, check this out. Here is some trends in drug use. This is an older image, as you can see. But clearly cocaine had a little bit of a spike in its use in the 80s, but it clearly has petered off, and I think that's still true. Alcohol has been on a decline. Marijuana, again, spiked in the 70s, but has been on a decline, although you see that little rise there. And based on my understanding, however, that clearly marijuana has spiked a lot. And that's an interesting thing. I'm not going to get on my high horse on it, but it's not as safe as people seem to think. People seem to think it's safe. Number one, just like with cigarettes, smoking marijuana leads to all kinds of toxins in the actual, like a cigarette, right? In a cigarette, you ingest nicotine, okay? And nicotine is not good for you, but nicotine itself is really not that big a deal. What is a big deal is all the cancerous chemicals that are in the tobacco leaves themselves that you're smoking. And in the same way, the horrible chemicals in those tobacco leaves are very similar to the horrible chemicals that are in the marijuana itself. So the THC, which actually creates the high, will get in there. Dope makes you stupid. There's clearly some evidence of that. But it's the toxins in the actual chemicals themselves, in the leaves themselves, that are a big problem. So who seeks treatment? So it turns out that, when people experience symptoms, they respond differently. Some people are just ready to seek help, some are not, okay? There's a lot of delays. Delays in seeking help can be very important because, of course, the earlier that problems are found, the easier it is to fix them. But clearly, one of the major problems here is it's related to health insurance, right? Those that have good health insurance are far, far, far more likely to seek treatment than those that do not. Okay, but we also find that communication. Here we go. Patient-provider communication, have a lot of that, technical jargon. Yeah, it turns out that many physicians are really not good at their job. They might be brilliant, physicians, but if they can't convey that information to their patients, then that's an idiot. I really think that all medical students need to take a whole lot of psychology courses, especially things like crisis intervention. But they clearly need to understand how to communicate with people that don't have the same medical knowledge that they do. And then finally, what we find is that adherence to medical advice. Patients aren't good at remembering things. If treatments are difficult or aversive, I mean, who's going to follow that, especially if there's side effects? Patient's attitude, clearly, in some cultures, again, where a man is a man, taking drugs is a bad, and so all of a sudden, there's a lot of different factors to not just, who goes to the doctor, but who follows up on what the doctor has to say. All right, so that's what we got for the first exam. So hopefully you're going to be getting ready and studying for that soon, and we'll talk to you after the exam.